but I want to give you a flavor of some of the requests that we get. And let me be clear, these aren't crazy requests. I'm not dismissing them. I'm going to talk about them each in a different flavor. Some of them come from really real and genuine places and real desires by the advertiser. And so it's important to think about how we address them. One request we got, and this was actually just 2 weeks ago, we want to have a guarantee on demographics, and we want a separate guarantee on viewability using one vendor for the demographics and a different one for the viewability, and they want the cross combination. And for those who haven't had a request like that, that has been an extremely hard thing operationally to service, even if you knew both of those vendors in detail, because knowing how they're going to interact causes you all sorts of challenges. And so this was obviously one where we started to have a conversation with the buyer on exactly how difficult that was going to be to implement. Down in the bottom left, request. We want publishers to deliver on mobile viewable impressions despite, again, the lack of accreditation standards that George talked about. And in a minute, I'll show some data of how much better the viewable numbers have got when we stripped out the mobile component. Top right, we want 100% viewability at the old CPM rates. Again, not a crazy request, but when you're coming from the publisher side, it puts you in a situation where the relationship with the buyer, in this case, could become pretty adversarial unless there's good intent and good education on both sides. Moving down the right-hand side, we want to use our own definition of viewability, and there are a couple of others out there that are different than the MRC guidelines that George talked about. And then finally, we want to be billed only for measurable impressions at no premium. And this isn't the same as the one before where it's viewed only for viewable impressions. For those who understand the difference, most vendors have what they call the viewable percentage, but that is based on how many they can measure. And in some cases, some of these vendors can only measure a relatively small proportion of the impressions. And so the usual rule of thumb is you extrapolate to those that they can't measure. In a case like this, that might mean, depending again on the vendor that you're using, that you're only able to count or measure 20% to 30% of the impressions on your site. So again, none of these are crazy requests, but they all fall in the category of things that I would say are either outside of standard guidelines or things where we believe that there needs to be better education about the market. I went in the wrong direction. Okay, so there are some structural issues that we all need to resolve. So this was alluded to earlier by Tom Shields, the first piece on daily reporting. When we use our own viewability numbers and when the buyer uses those same numbers, operationally, it's relatively easy for us. We get our reports, we know how to pace the campaigns, we know whether we're on track or not on track. One of the largest pain points that we have, even working with one of, I'll say, the big 4 vendors that we work with on a regular basis, is getting access to daily reports at the campaign level. Tom alluded to it, it's a real pain point. If you don't have those daily reports, then you can easily end up in a situation where you've made commitments to viewable numbers and you're flying blind as to how you're delivering against that. And so obviously one of the main things we've been focused on is how to establish those relationships with the key measurement vendors to ensure we're getting the information that we need at the time we need it. The second piece is lag time, and I've got at least 2 examples. One is when the IAB came out with their guidelines on the large ads, the ones that are much greater size than the standard ad units, the rule of thumb was only 30% of the pixels needed to be in view. It took months for us to see that broadly adopted across the landscape, and while it was not adopted, it obviously led to confusion in the conversations between ourselves and the buyers. And then the third piece is actually related, measurement across different formats. I would say that on the standard IAB units, your 300 by 250s, your banners, etc., we're getting pretty good agreement across many of the vendors. The problem comes when you use anything that's outside of standard, and in some cases, those are the most valuable units, and then you're selling your most valuable units in a situation where one of the vendors you're working with may not even be able to measure them. I almost don't need to talk about the first one here today, but I want to put on the table that unfortunately the rise towards viewability is coming at a time when we are facing a couple of structural issues in terms of the inventory or the supply that we have available. One is obviously ad blocking. I'm not going to belabor the points that's been talked about so much today, but to some respect, any of the power save modes that have been going on with Flash have, at least in the short term, while we're dealing with the final tail of the migration from Flash into HTML5, have caused us issues in terms of thinking about the viewability of these units, because the ad will start to render, but obviously the animation won't play, and the question of was that unit viewable or not, and especially then where the user clicks, have been a constraint on the availability of impressions. And so, unfortunately, some of these things are happening at the worst time as we're trying to build the amount of viewability that's transacted. So the good. This is Blondie, for those who don't know, Clint Eastwood. And there's a lot of good. So let me give a couple of examples. And I want to state by saying the reason I'm giving this talk is Yahoo's absolutely committed to viewability. And I want to share some of the things that we are dealing with to try to make our site more viewable. This is the Yahoo front page. For those who haven't been on it recently, it scrolls in the story. I want to show you an ad that loads below the fold. If we keep scrolling, look on the right column, where deliberately there's a lag. You're going to see the lag fill in, and we should get a unit there. Slow down a little bit. But the notion is if you kept scrolling, that unit is now sticky. It stays in view. So it's not, you might say, well, isn't that just a lazy load? The fact that it's a lazy load, but then is a lazy load where, again, if you continue to stream, the unit stays in the viewable pane, and we have the option, depending on the other actions that the user takes, to rotate that ad and actually create additional inventory. When we did this action, what happened was we took a unit that had very low viewability rates and actually very low value either to ourselves or to the buyer, and turned it into an extremely valuable unit. All of the engagement, the units that we track, including click-through rates, interaction, et cetera, went through the roof. And in terms of buyers actually bidding in on that unit, what we found was when we exposed it to exchange and demand-side platforms, they also valued that unit multiple times higher than they had when it had been below the fold and didn't have that type of behavior. So that's one of the things that we can do.